Even in games where Manchester City was ahead, they still managed to blow their lead against Brighton, against Brentford, where they were also ahead and blew their lead. Against PSG in the Champions League, Manchester City was ahead in the match, yet they still lost that game. Manchester City's attacking threat is still there, but this season they have struggled defensively. For the fourth year in a row, Real Madrid faces the team with 115 financial fair play violations. Manchester City is currently 5th in the Premier League after suffering 7 defeats this season. City has conceded 35 goals so far, which is one more goal than the entire campaign last year. In this video, I'll break down Manchester City's tactical weaknesses and how Real Madrid can exploit them, despite Real Madrid having a shaky start to the season. This is the first season since Cristiano Ronaldo left Real Madrid where Real Madrid is the favorites to beat Manchester City. At the end, I'll provide my prediction for this match, so stick around to the end. The first tactical weakness Real Madrid can exploit from Manchester City is their poor build-up from the back. This season, Manchester City is struggling with ball progression. Unlike the years in the past where Manchester City had a lot of structure in their team, this season they're struggling to move the ball forward. And that's why you're seeing sides like Arsenal pressing them high up the pitch, winning it back, and having clear goal-scoring opportunities. In years past, teams were reluctant to press Manchester City high up the pitch because they were so efficient in moving the ball forward that it left you vulnerable to counterattacks. So teams would sit a little bit deeper against City. But this season, that is not the case anymore. Teams are pressing Manchester City high up the pitch because they're not efficiently moving the ball forward. And although Real Madrid is not very effective in pressing, we saw in the first Clasico in the first half that Real Madrid can press teams effectively, but it hasn't been sustained for Real Madrid. In this game, you have to approach the game with a more aggressive style. But unlike Arsenal, Real Madrid doesn't have this collective commitment to pressing because Arsenal is more used to it and they have a more structured system. Which brings me to my second point, which is don't be forced to sit too deep in this game. In this fixture last year at the Etihad, we sat pretty deep against Manchester City, at times going to a back 5 to prevent them from cycling the ball to the wide players and congesting the middle to not allow them to have shots from outside the box. But with Tchouaméni and Asensio projected to be the two starters at center back, these are two players that don't have a lot of experience at the highest levels playing against the most elite center forwards in Europe. So if you invite pressure and you have a situation where Tchouaméni is constantly having to defend against Erling Haaland, you need to take the game to Manchester City, especially with their 3 midfielders that they're likely to be playing, which is Bernardo Silva, Kovacic, and Gundogan. And if Real Madrid plays a midfield of Jude Bellingham, Camavinga, and Ceballos, physically, Real Madrid will have the energy and the physicality in midfield to be able to keep up with those players. And as I mentioned earlier, Manchester City's organizational structure is not what it was over the last few years. And that's why teams have found a lot of success this year against Manchester City in transition, especially later in games because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, even in games where Manchester City was scoring goals and they were ahead by 2-3 goals, they were still blowing those leads later into the game because they were not able to prevent those teams from having those transition opportunities. Not to mention the fact that Kyle Walker will be out for this game. So not having Kyle Walker and his pace in the back is also going to be something that's devastating. And the other thing is Manchester City has been resorting to playing Lewis at right back. Lewis versus Kyle Walker against Vinicius or against Mbappe, whoever is going to be playing on that left side, that is a huge mismatch for them. And one of the biggest threats for Manchester City is Guardiola. But a lot of the times when Guardiola has pushed higher up the pitch, he's left a lot of space in behind him. If Guardiola is looking to create and push high up the pitch, in theory, that should leave a lot of space open for Rodrigo. And that brings me to my third point, which is don't be dragged out of position. One of the things that Real Madrid has struggled with this season, besides being compact, is organizational structure without the ball. I mentioned in a previous video about how important the game plan was last year from Real Madrid to sit in a deeper block, to be organized, to sometimes sit in a back 5, and not to give Manchester City those opportunities to cycle the ball out into the wide space in an effort to move players out of position to cycle the ball into the middle. Even in games where they're getting thrashed, they had the majority of the possession against Arsenal, and yet they still lost 5-1. So it's safe to say that Real Madrid will have less possession in this game. But what is important is when you don't have possession of the ball, it's still remaining organized. But if there is anything that we've learned about Real Madrid this season, is that in games where we've really committed to pressing, we have struggled. So if there is going to be a game plan of pressing the ball high up the pitch by Carlo Ancelotti, then it needs to be a collective press. In both Clásicos this season, we tried to press Barcelona, but we all saw what happened with those games. The key for Real Madrid is if there's ever a team that you want to press, although you're not good at it, it is Manchester City because they're going through one of their worst spells. But when they do have the ball, and they are going to have the majority of the possession, is don't allow them to move you out of position by cycling the ball out into the wide spaces, and our players get dragged out of position and opens up spaces for them, because that's what they look to do. And that brings me to point number 4, which is play Jude Bellingham slightly deeper than usual in this game, because as I mentioned, Manchester City is going to be pressing high up the pitch, and you're going to need Jude Bellingham to help you escape pressure. And there's no better player in the team to receive the ball under pressure and hold up the ball almost like a target man than Jude Bellingham. We saw in the game against Atalanta that Carlo Ancelotti used Brahim Diaz in this role in the first half, but in the second half he asked Vinicius to play that role to receive the ball, and obviously he famously played that ball over the top to Jude Bellingham that he scored towards the end. But in this game, Jude Bellingham is the guy who needs to be receiving those passes, because when he has his back to the opposition, if you need somebody to hold up the play, to be a physical presence with the ball, that's Jude Bellingham. And you are going to need him to do that in this game. Last season at the Etihad, Toni Kroos was our best player in that match. So many times he helped us escape pressure. And obviously you don't have anybody with the profile of a Toni Kroos, because he can pick out the right pass time and time again, not to mention his long balls. And that brings me to my 5th point, which is Dani Ceballos' pass selection. In Real Madrid's last match, Dani Ceballos completed 99% of his passes. But obviously that game was much different because Real Madrid was playing against Atletico Madrid at home, where we had the majority of possession. In this game against Manchester City, although they're nowhere near the side they were last season, Dani Ceballos is going to be a key player in this game because not only of his defensive intensity that he provides you without the ball, but he's a player, as Carlo Ancelotti describes, who can control the rhythm and the tempo of the game for you. But there are times where Dani Ceballos' pass selection is not the right pass. And sometimes those passes can make the difference between Real Madrid giving up a transition opportunity to the opposition or playing a pass to one of the wide players. Although Dani Ceballos has proven himself to be very underrated as a player, and he's played so far very well and he deserves the praise and respect, but if you pay attention to some of the passes that he makes, there are a very few instances, it doesn't happen a lot, where the pass selection exposes the team sometimes. But the good news is Real Madrid is not playing against a very physical, dominating midfield in this game. As I mentioned, it's likely that Manchester City will play with Kovacic, Bernardo Silva, and Gundogan. Although these guys are really good with the ball, physically, Real Madrid should be able to dominate the game because of how physical our midfield is. And that's why it's really important for Dani Ceballos not to really play any adventurous passes. The trigger for Manchester City's press is they look to identify opportunities where the wrong pass is made. The big point with Dani Ceballos is to just play the safer passes, no adventurous passes, especially in situations where the team could be vulnerable to a counterattack. Let me know if you guys agree with the top 5 things that I identified. One of the biggest fears that I had was Marmoush against Lucas Vazquez, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen, which is a relief. But that means Federico Valverde is likely to play as a right back. And although I would love to have Valverde in the midfield in this game, having us as a right back is a really great insurance policy. Like I said, Manchester City has still been scoring goals this season. Offensively, they're still able to create. They still have elite forwards. But what they're struggling with is preventing teams in transition from scoring against them. They're struggling later in games. They're blowing leads when they're ahead. So even if Real Madrid is behind in this match early in the game, which is plausible because let's face it, defensively, we've struggled this season. We can still come back, equalize, win the game. As Real Madrid, you need to have that confidence in yourselves because of how poor defensively Manchester City has been, especially later in games. The teams that they're blowing leads to, these are not the most elite sides in Europe. And that's why I predict that Real Madrid will win by a 4-2 margin. Let me know if you guys agree with my analysis. In the last game against Atletico, I predicted a 1-1, so let's see if I can continue to keep the streak going. I'll be doing a live immediately after the game to give you guys some of the analysis. Hopefully it'll be a happy live, so make sure you guys stay tuned to that. Thank you all for watching. Hala Madrid.